Hey there, everyone. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the role of South and Southeast Asia during the beginnings here in AP World History. So first, let's introduce like sort of what the College Board is saying that they would like you to know. They've got two main content objectives. The first one focuses on religion and belief systems. The second one is on politics and governance. So let's take a little bit of time and break this down so that you really understand what it is the College Board is looking for in terms of this particular time period. So step back and let's take a look at sort of the big picture here. And it can seem overwhelming, right? We've got a lot of competing states, kingdoms, empires, and what we want to try to do is make some sense of this. So the first thing I want to caution you is really take some time here in this particular time period to look at South and Southeast Asia. It can be really tempting to skim over this since they really seem to be on the fringe of a lot of the major interactions, right? In terms of trade, Mongol conquest, they're on the periphery of that. We talk about the influence of their neighbors in terms of the Islamic empires, China, a little bit more, but South and Southeast Asia are a really good place to step back and talk about the convergence of three of our major religions, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. It's really key that we also spend some time looking at the background of this region. It's really going to become important starting in 1450 and really beyond through the rest of the course as we talk about the arrival of the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Europeans, moving in and competing for influence, power, territory, wealth, trade in this region. And that's really something that's going to be a continuity through the remainder of this course is the influence of Europeans in this region, right? Whether it's talking about the French in Indochina, what becomes Vietnam in Southeast Asia, whether we talk about the Dutch in Indonesia, whether we talk about, the Spanish and Portuguese competing for trade. That's really going to be a key thing that we're going to focus on later. So let's spend some time today to talk a little bit about the background and how that becomes possible. And to do that, we need to start with the Indian Ocean Trade Network. The world's most important, at least rivaling the Silk Road, if not the most important, one of the most important, right up there with the Silk Road. As people began to really improve technology in terms of shipbuilding, navigation, the environmental knowledge, including advanced knowledge of the monsoon winds, allowed really improved commercial practices and a huge explosion of growth in trade. And that's going to lead to the growth of powerful new trading cities, Calicut in India, Malacca, and the growth of new powerful empires and states. India is going to be the focus of this. The fulcrum of trade was in India, the pivot point of all of this trade network. This is where we see a huge increase in cross-cultural interactions, the diffusion of arts, literature, cultural traditions, religion. Again, Hinduism, Islam, and Buddhism really play an important role here in shaping societies in South and Southeast Asia. This is where it all begins. So let's think about how these religious practices affected the society, the development of states in South and Southeast Asia. Again, we got a lot of sort of political units to cover, but generally speaking, let's talk about the arrival of Islam in South and Southeast Asia. Islam introduced starting in North India and spreading to South and Southeast Asia really began as a proselytizing religion, meaning they were actively out seeking converts. And the main attraction was to low-caste Hindus and lower-status Buddhists who hoped that conversion would improve their social standing. Most converts were Buddhist. Buddhism was highly disorganized during this time period. There were competing strains and thoughts. And Islam and Hinduism actually began to push out Buddhism. It became a minority religion in South Asia, right? The place where it started, the place where Buddhism began, it became a minority religion in that region. While Islam made important introductions politically and religiously, there wasn't a whole lot of impact initially on social traditions. For example, the caste system remained a strong continuity, very rigid social structure that really never quite lessened in influence even despite the introduction of Islam. And rather what we see is the emergence of syncretism, a blending of religious ideas and beliefs. In the image on the right, you can see an example of this here, right? We have a Hindu temple that was built over top of, right, with an Islamic mosque. And so here we have this minaret, this very traditional example of Islamic architecture, right on top of a Hindu temple, right? In fact, this is actually an example of the tallest structure in India. This is really how we want to think about these religions, is a blending, as a melting pot of Hindu, Islamic, and even Buddhist architectural styles and cultural traditions and beliefs. Sufism will be really key and important in spreading Islam to Southeast Asia, in particular, this group of Muslim missionaries, this mystical strain of Islam, partially because of their willingness to accommodate local traditions, Hindu gods, religious festivals. Makes it much more acceptable, again, to lower class Hindus who see this as non-threatening, right? But they still accept some of the Hindu gods and religious festivals. At the same time, we also see a very parallel movement with the Bhakti movement. It's a very spiritual movement within Hinduism that, again, spread through missionary efforts like Sufism. They did not discriminate by gender or by social status. And so we have these two parallel missionary efforts introducing the spread of Islam and the spread of Hinduism into Southeast Asia during this time period, and leading to that mixture, that syncretic mixture of religions. Now, when we talk about the political side of things, this is where I think students tend to panic a little bit. And the question is, oh my God, where do I start? There's so many states, so many empires. What should I focus on? And so my advice to students is always this, right? This is the illustrative example that the College Board has provided. And what they say is that you should really know one or two of these. My advice to students is always choose one or two of these, dig a little bit into the background, become familiar with them enough that you can write something on a free response question. You can provide some examples, some context, a few details, right, to really make it fit within that context of world history. The multiple choice, right, are not going to be that specific. You will not get questions that are very detailed on these empires specifically, because they know they recommend this as an example, and they know that like you're going to have examples from one or two. So my advice is to focus on the free response, the writing section for this, because that's really going to be where you're going to get the most bang for your buck to help you out and to sort of make sense of some of these political units, right? Because there's a lot of them. Now, when we talk about these, I'm going to give you just a very brief overview. This is no means meant to be comprehensive or the end all be all. So let's jump right in and talk about just a couple of these political units so that you have some information to begin with, and you can dig a little bit more as you go. In northern India, we have two major political units. First, we'll talk about the establishment of the Rajput kingdoms following the fall of the Gupta Empire from classical India. These competing Hindu kingdoms really struggled for power with no centralized government, left them very vulnerable to Muslim invasions. Particularly in the 11th century, right, you see a wave of Islamic invasions that began to loot and plunder Hindu temples and Buddhist shrines. The establishment of the Delhi Sultanate in the 13th century introduced Islamic rule in a more formalized way into northern India. The key here, though, is with both of these is that they never established a centralized bureaucracy. This is sort of the political legacy of northern India, right? Think back to your World History 1 class, your previous history class, right? It's all about regionalism. It's all about fractured power. There's no centralized bureaucracy. There's localized power and rule. That's the sort of the carryover into this time period as well. In southern India, the Delhi Sultanate does capture the area here in the south. But what's interesting about this is they actually become sort of a competing Hindu kingdom. The armies that splintered off here in southern India served as a buffer state against Muslim invasions from the north. Despite the fact that they came from the Delhi Sultanate, they established this Hindu kingdom as a period of peace and prosperity. It becomes a very flourishing time, right? Interactions with Muslims and trade did lead to cultural diffusion, the introduction of new ideas. Literature thrives under Sanskrit as a unifying sort of common thread throughout the society. But one of our longer political units here for about 300 years, but eventually will fall to Muslim invasions and internal strife. In Southeast Asia. Right. Again, I'm going to give you a very sort of brief overview because both China and India have some influence here in what we think of as modern day Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia, so on. What we want to focus on is the introduction of Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam from India and across this trading period. So let's give you sort of a brief overview here. We have two competing sea-based kingdoms, right, on the island of Sumatra, right, along the Strait of Malacca. We have the Srivijaya Empire, which is prosperous from trade. They have a strong navy. Again, their location along the Strait of Malacca gives them sort of a geographic advantage. They charge taxes and fees on ships that come through and are really able to profit from that. Right, on the island of Java, right, we have the competing Majapahit kingdom, which also profited from sea trade, becomes a major Buddhist center of thought. Monasteries, the establishment of many Buddhist monasteries in this kingdom as well. Right, we have some land-based kingdoms. One that I would particularly recommend focusing on is the Khmer Empire, or the Angkor Kingdom. It's located along the Mekong River. This is a little bit different in that they didn't depend on maritime expansion, right? They're an agricultural kingdom focused on cultivation of rice, particularly those fast-growing strains of champa rice. Real innovative in terms of agriculture, right? They discovered ways to create several harvests of crops within a calendar year, and the knowledge of the monsoons and irrigation really allowed them to profit off the agricultural trade. And it also serves as a really good example of Indian influence in Southeast Asia. You see a lot of Hindu temples with artwork and sculptures that later becomes blended with and overlaid with Buddhist artwork. The Hindu scriptures are right there alongside the Buddhist writings in art. Right, it's not that they replaced them; it was sort of an add-on, and so we get a lot of, again, that focus on syncretic religion. Right, and here's a good example, right, that of a must-know, that the Temple of Angkor Wat. Right, I think this is one that a lot of students should be able to recognize and be able to discuss a little bit and spend some time with. This is a Hindu temple, right, in modern-day Cambodia, right, that was transformed into a Buddhist temple. And so you really get to see the sort of interplay, the overlying of the two religions and belief systems. Again, I kind of gave you a very brief overview here. Just wanted to put some context and establishment on this. If you find that you need more resources, there's a playlist here that you're welcome to access. The URL is there. If you have a QR reader, you can use that as well. But I hope this video was helpful in at least sort of helping you get the basics and the context of this down. And we'll talk a little bit later. Our next topic will be developments in the Americas. All right, so we will jump across the Atlantic and look at what's happening in Central America, Latin America next.